I'd like to now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nickolas Papanikolaou from Lisbon. He will be speaking on AI and machine learning techniques for smaller data sets.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Don't worry, this is not my usual working outfit. So the main three drivers regarding the AI success story are the data availability, the increased computational power, and the refinements in machine learning algorithms. So I have 25 minutes, more or less, to devote to the most challenging problem that we are facing in radiomics, and that is data availability. So we will go through basic concepts, methods, and techniques of AI, but mostly focusing on the challenges of radiomics and how to overcome those problems. So radiological diagnosis traditionally is based on the combination of training, experience, and individual judgment of the radiologist. However, radiologists are using visual perception in order to identify different kinds of imaging patterns and associate them with the presence or absence of the disease. Can I have back the slides, please? Thank you. That makes radiological diagnosis very sensitive to variability. And that is the main reason why there is a current shift from subjective evaluation into more quantitative aspects of imaging, where in principle it can provide a wealth of information, it can act in a more objective way and therefore reduce variability. However, we are still challenged by the fact that most of our modalities are not designed to act as quantitative devices rather than to produce pretty pictures. And at the top of that, you have the lack of protocol standardization. Now, tumor histology classification is mainly based on biopsy, and we all know that biopsy is expensive, it suffers from sampling errors, and it's invasive. On the other hand, imaging provides attractive features like the possibility to assess the entire tumor due to three-dimensional visualization capabilities. Its non-invasive, but most importantly, its non-destructive nature is of paramount importance because it makes it ideal to be applied multiple times during the course of the disease, and therefore we can extract important tumor evolution information. However, at the moment it lacks of microscopic resolution. There is some radiation involvement in some of the modalities, and it is based mostly on subjective radiological opinions. That is the main reason why radiomics, which is a new discipline that combines ideas from medical imaging, statistics, and computer science, has been proposed and is in progress, where we are trying to develop and design new algorithms that, through data processing, can make predictions and therefore aid to accurate clinical decision-making. Now, what about the number of data that someone should use? Of course, it is more than evident that the more data you have, the better the training process is, but we need also to consider two other aspects: the quality of data and the diversity of data. At the top of that, another challenge is the fact that we need to recruit experts in order to annotate and label those data, and that can be expensive. We also have another problem, that is the fact that statistics, both in basic level and advanced level, are not so common in the curriculum of radiologists. Therefore, that results in different kinds of methodological errors, like the absence of multiple comparison correction, not appropriate feature selection, and all these might result into highly over-optimistic performances. Now, if you will combine that, most probably what you will end up with is a model that basically memorizes rather than generalizes, and that can be addressed also on the fact that most of the people are not having external validation, and therefore, most of the times we have highly over-optimistic estimates. Now, there are two different pathways in AI and medical imaging. The machine learning part, which to my view is not a very accurate terminology, but it implies the segmentation of a region of interest and then the extraction of corresponding imaging features coming from those regions of interest in order to feed a classifier and make a prediction. On the other hand, the deep learning approach doesn't need this kind of segmentations, and the process of feature extraction and classification is integrated. A typical radiomics workflow comprises of many different steps like image acquisition, pre-processing, segmentation, feature extraction, analysis, and reporting. We will mainly focus on the analysis part. Now, the most common problems that can be found in machine learning, and in particular in medical imaging, can be classification problems. Is it benign or malignant? Is it responding or non-responding to treatment? Regression problems, how much or how many? Or clustering problems, how is it organized, what belongs to each other? The first two categories are mainly done through the so-called supervised learning, where both input and output variables are recruited during the training process, while in the unsupervised learning part, we are trying to identify correlations and associations between the data without letting the algorithm know what was the ground truth. This is an example of an unsupervised learning algorithm. That's a hierarchical clustering method where we have identified 15 different texture features that practically was capable of discriminating between two different clusters. One that was comprising exclusively of patients on the right side, and those were patients with pancreatic cancer, and another one that was mostly populated by normal controls with just one misclassified patient. Now, the first step to conduct analysis is the so-called univariate analysis, where we are trying to access to evaluate the worth of each individual feature in order to measure how it can discriminate between the two different classes. And this is an example of such a univariate analysis where texture entropy maps are shown to be different in terms of malignant infiltrative ductal carcinoma, and that can be denoted by the red color in those maps over the far lower entropy values that someone can identify on benign fibroadenomas. Usually, we have to evaluate from a very large pool of features, most of the times more than 100, and that always makes this kind of analysis very sensitive to pick up features that can discriminate between the two classes only by chance. Therefore, multiple comparisons correction, like Benjamini-Hockenberg or Bonferroni, are of paramount importance to be applied in those cases. Now, in radiomics, as in most of the omics problems, there is a characteristic imbalance between the number of patients, the number of samples, and the radiomic features. And that basically leads to the increased sensitivity and possibility of overfitting due to the fact that radiomics suffers from the curse of dimensionality as being a high dimensional problem. And overfitting is one of the most, I think it's the biggest enemy at the moment that we need to combat and reduce. And that can be done by accurate feature selection. So just to give you a more intuitive example of overfitting, let's consider an electrical engineer who recently resigned his job in a company, and then the HR comes up with such an advertisement: wanted 15 years old androgynous person with a PhD degree in electrical engineering and animal husbandry. Must be 1.76 meters tall with brown hair and a mole over the left eye and prone to discussions against globalization. So mathematically, overfitting means that someone is recruiting and building a model with more features that are really necessary. Now, another problem could be underfitting. So underfitting in that case could be a white male between 1.5 and 2 meters tall with hair and a degree in science. So normally someone should target the right candidate by providing such a posting, senior engineer with degree in electrical engineering or mathematics, preferably a PhD. Now, how to prevent overfitting? This can be done utilizing different kinds of strategies. First of all, resampling techniques like cross-validation, train with more data if they are available, reduce dimensionality of the feature space, use regularization and sample learning or transfer learning. So typically the learning process is comprised of 3 different phases: the training, the development or optimization, and the testing. And normally, you should have separated data sets, one for training/development and another one for testing. But unfortunately, this is not the case in most of the times in radiology. So what we are forced to do is to utilize a single data set and split it into a training/development and a testing data set. Now, that is not a very efficient way to train your models, and therefore other resampling techniques like the KFold Crossvalidation are proposed. Basically, according to this algorithm, what we are trying to do is to divide the entire data set into K partitions or folds and keep out one of them for testing and utilize K-1 folds for training. In this way, all the data sets, they have the possibility to be part of the testing or training process. Finally, we are calculating the accuracy of each individual fold, and we are taking the average and standard deviation. Now, most of the times you need to perform the so-called stratified K-fold cross-validation, where in that case, the relative distribution of the 2 classes on the total data set needs to be respected when resampling. Maybe this is the most important slide in my presentation. What do we have here? We have the curves that are describing how the prediction error is related to the model complexity. And as you may identify, there are 2 areas here. One that is basically models with high bias and low variance, and those are the low complexity models. And this is a typical area where underfitting takes place. And another area, which is the low bias, high variance, where typically you have overfitting. Now, it is our job to be able to identify this so-called sweet spot where you get the lowest prediction error comparing to the model complexity. And a perfect way to do that is the so-called feature selection or feature reduction methods. So those are methods that are trying to identify a small subset of highly predictive features that most of the times are the stable, robust, and highly informative. And just what we are trying to do is to identify, let's say, the small golden stones with this huge sample. And there are 3 main categories regarding feature selection techniques: the filtered methods, the wrapper methods, and the embedded. Now, feature selection normally takes place in waves, in various phases. So we are starting with assessing stability of our features, and then stable features are those that they survive and they move to the next stage, where we are trying to remove the so-called useless features, those that they don't change their values across the patients. After that, we remove the redundant features, those that are highly correlated between themselves. And finally, we are applying a more sophisticated machine learning algorithm like MRMR or recursive feature elimination in order to cone down to our final radiomic signature. This is just an example. We have downloaded from TCIA the RIDER NeuroMRI dataset, where 19 patients with recurrent glioblastomas underwent at least twice MRI exams. And we have calculated the percentage of features that were stable between the 2 different exams. And as you may see, up to 40% of features can be really unstable, and they have to be removed from further modeling. Now, for correlation analysis, for identifying the redundant features, someone has to do this correlation matrix, where even visually you can identify blocks of features that are highly correlated between themselves and therefore remove them utilizing an objective threshold like a correlation coefficient. Most of the times it ranges between 0.8 and 0.9. This is an example coming from a breast ultrasound, an automatic breast ultrasound data set comprising 131 patients. We had benign and malignant breast lesions, and through the application of several feature selection methods, we have identified, starting from 1,000 features more or less, and coned down to 11 that were the most informative, achieving a rather interesting performance up to 85%. Now, by adding the BI-RAD scoring coming from a radiologist, you can understand that the performance gains more than 10%. So the combination of the human and the radiomic analysis is the best choice in that case. So one very important thing to know is that in case you do this feature selection before training the data, there is a high risk of leaking the ground truth. And that can definitely lead to highly biased and optimistic estimates. And in order to avoid that, you need to perform the feature selection within your KFold cross-validation for each individual training fold. Now, regularization is a form of regression that constrains and reduces and forces coefficients of worthless features to become zero. And in other words, that kind of technique is penalizing highly complex models and therefore reduces the risk of overfitting. Among the most popular regularization methods in radiomics are the lasso methods. Now, ensample has been already mentioned, and basically those are machine learning methods that are combining predictions from multiple separate models. There are three main versions of ensample training, and that is the bagging methods coming from bootstrap aggregation, where we are trying to reduce the chance of overfitting by recruiting strong learners that are producing predictions in parallel. And basically a strong learner means a highly complex model, a model with many features. And basically bagging is combining all the strong learners' performance together in order to smooth out their predictions. The boosting method, on the other hand, is utilizing weak learners, so low complexity machine learning models that are trained sequentially, which means that every machine learning model is learning from the mistakes of the previous one, and then we combine all together to a single strong learner. Finally, the stacking or voting approach is based on a collective decision making by taking into consideration the performance of the different member models. So normally what we are trying to do is all the models are giving predictions in a separate way, and then we, by utilizing the majority of votes, we are trying to build a more accurate model. And it has been shown that the combination of different models can produce lower errors comparing to the individual models themselves. Transfer learning was already mentioned, and it's an approach where we are using knowledge that has been learned in different kind of tasks, in our case images, and basically this theory is inspired by the way that people can intuitively use their previous learned experiences to define and solve new problems. So what is really interesting with transfer learning is that in the first layers of the deep neural networks, there appear to be some common features. Normally, these are Gabor filters or color blobs. And basically, someone can exploit those features in order to cone down with your own data. And we have presented in last ECR a clinical model utilizing transfer learning, where, again, three well-known deep convolutional neural networks trained on ImageNet, the Inception V3, the VGG 16 and 19, were used in a pre-trained fashion, and we have injected, let's say, only 156 ABUS data at the final latest layers of these models, and that produced, surprisingly enough, a rather interesting performance, and AUC about 90% to differentiate between normal and abnormal breast tissue. So as take-home messages, someone should consider investing time and effort to become familiar with novel AI concepts. You need to initiate projects that are not only based on the clinical importance, but also on the availability of the proper amount and type of data. You need to at least utilize 2 different platforms in order to cross-check your model performance and avoid some kind of systematic errors. And finally, radiomics is a multidisciplinary project involving not only radiologists, but also biomedical engineers, biostatisticians, computer scientists, as well as clinicians. And with that, I want to acknowledge the clinical computational imaging group here at Champalimaud, and of course, our fellow radiologists that are supporting us and most of the times trying to bring us to down to earth, because we have the tendency to fly. And thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, I'd like to entertain any questions from the audience first, please. Anyone with any questions, raise your hand, and we'll have a microphone brought to you. Okay. Yes.
I'm Catherine Clout. I'm a radiologist from England. I was interested that you said that when you change your equipment, it can completely change how the system works, and how an algorithm system would work. So does that mean if you then purchased a commercial system, you've both got to domestically evaluate it, and then every time you have any upgrade of any equipment, you've got to re-evaluate it?
Hello? I think it would be wise to do that. I think to the extent possible that you can see a fair amount of degradation in the model performance when you change, certainly if you change your manufacturer, I would think it's a good idea to reevaluate it with a new system. System upgrades, it depends on the kind of change, but it's for a lot of these systems, I really do think it's important to make sure that it works with your current image quality. And there's been a lot of talk about that in terms of data set variation and why some of these models stop working after a while, and it's because of all of these other upgrades that happen. Do you want to talk about any comments on that?
We know, for example, that when you change, even a change in the reconstruction kernel in a CT device, for example, even with the same manufacturer, but with some changes in the algorithm of how it reconstructs the images, will change the impact on the performance of an AI model that's been trained on images.
Could I ask one second question in relation to that? In the fact that we're always, particularly with CT data, you're trying to reduce dose, and is there then an issue with dose reduction and signal to noise and AI versus higher dose scans as a result?
It's a good question. Again, I think as your SNR changes for a lot of these systems, you might see textural changes, for instance, and so if you're doing radiomics, you'll potentially see the impact of dose variation on that. Even for deep learning, I think, depending on how specific the model was for the appearance of that, you might see a difference. I don't know if you want to comment on it.
Well, just coming back to your initial question, the answer is it depends. It depends on what kind of features your final model is comprised of. For example, we have seen that if your model is based on shape-related features. Those are far more robust to any changes that might be introduced from the vendor. But if it's about low-level texture features, most probably you have to consider retraining your models after a significant update in the software of the vendor. And by the way, we are taking that into consideration when building the radiomic signature. So one of the ways to assess stability of our features is also to compare how specific features vary along different vendors. And we remove those that are variable. So we are trying to build radiomic signatures that are stable enough, not only due to different kind of acquisition parameters, but also due to different vendors. That's why it is very challenging to end up with a global model that works out of the box.
Yeah, Jasper Nijkamp, imaging scientist from Amsterdam. I wonder, transfer learning has been mentioned quite a lot, but we mainly want to focus on using 3D convolutional neural networks instead of 2D. Are there any nice big 3D data sets out there, or is there any view on getting them anytime soon?
It's a good question, and I think we'd all benefit greatly by having medical image net type data sets, especially for 3D. I don't know that there's any out there at the moment of the scale that we might want. I mean, a lot of the networks are 3D CNNs, so most people do use 3D CNNs, but in terms of having a nice pre-trained model that we can use, I have not seen nearly as much.
As far as segmentation concerns, things are far easier, as it already has been mentioned, since you don't need thousands or hundreds of thousands of cases. So these kind of data sets are already existing. The problem comes when you want to do classification tasks, mostly related to clinical outcomes, because those are the most heterogeneous type of tasks. And in that case, I believe, I don't know if someone else has a different information, but data sets comprising thousands or hundreds of thousands 3D data is not so common. I'm not sure if it exists yet.
Okay. Next question, please. Yes. I don't have access to the...
Do you want to look at my... Yeah. Okay, Prof P. Fine-tune only used 156 cases. Does this mean you will soon be churning out algorithms for loads of conditions in no time at all?
Yeah, that's a tough... yeah, I think so, yeah.
There's one more question here regarding data curation. If models are trained on perfect data, what do you expect to happen? How to proceed when classifying a new examination contains an artifacts?
Also a really good question. Definitely the model performance degrades when the data get noisier or have artifacts, especially if the training was done on data that was very clean. And I think as model developers, it's really good to make sure that you have realistic data and not just perfect data when you create your model. Make sure that the data represents the kind of artifacts that you expect to see. Often if you have a good forward model, you can, during the training process, you can use synthetic data that can reflect some of this variability that you might see, or artificially introduce various things that you can see. So I think to the extent that the model developer can, they should build in for some of this robustness. But the model definitely will not perform as well if it's not seen that kind of artifact before. It can learn to ignore artifacts if it's seen plenty of them, but if it's a new kind of artifact, it makes things a lot harder. So.
Well, I'd like to have just one more question because I don't want to take up this time for the next session. Some states that N10 is optimal for KFold cross-section validation. What do you think? N is equal to 10 is optimal for tenfold cross-validation that you mentioned?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
The number of folds, K folds means tenfold cross-validation, means that K equals to 10.
Okay. Is that optimal?
Well, okay. That directly relates to the amount of the patients that you are resampling. So, for example, if you have a data set of 50 patients, and if you use tenfold cross-validation, that means that you are reserving only 5 patients for testing.
Oh, I see.
So in that case, you should use somewhat lower value, like 5 or even 3.
Mhm.
So it really depends on how many patients in total you have available to resample.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank our speakers for very informative lectures today, and thank you for great questions. So thank you.